Hey friends, I'm back. I have missed you. Let's get right to it. We're going to read Module 5, The Chemistry of Life. This is Part 3. I'm beginning on page 140 at photosynthesis. Photosynthesis. Now that you understand how to interpret chemical equations, let's talk about photosynthesis, a subject we've already discussed, but not in detail. The most prevalent means by which autotrophic organisms create their own food is photosynthesis. As you already learned, this process converts carbon dioxide and water into oxygen and a simple sugar called glucose. The balanced chemical equation is 6CO2 plus 6H2O yields C6H12O6 plus 6O2. In photosynthesis, then, 6 carbon dioxide, CO2 molecules interact with 6 water, H2O molecules. Once they interact, one glucose molecule, C6H12O6, and 6 oxygen, O2 molecules are formed. Think for a moment about what you've already learned regarding photosynthesis, and you'll probably realize that something is missing from this chemical equation. What is it? Well, you've already learned that photosynthesis requires sunlight. Where is the sunlight in this equation? Sunlight isn't in the equation, but it is still necessary in photosynthesis. You see, if a bunch of carbon dioxide and water were put into a container, they would not interact to form glucose and oxygen. In order for them to interact, the carbon dioxide and water molecules must be pushed together. This takes energy, which the plant gets from sunlight. Okay then, in order for plants to make glucose and oxygen, they just need carbon dioxide, water, and energy, right? Well, no. Even after supplying a lot of energy to a container full of carbon dioxide and water, you would not produce much glucose. You see, even with a lot of supplied energy, the interaction between carbon dioxide and water is very slow. Thus, the reaction would have to continue for a long, long time before even a small amount of glucose would be produced. This is unacceptable to an autotrophic organism because it must produce a lot of food for itself. Thus, the organism must speed up the reaction, making it produce glucose much faster than it normally would. How does an organism speed up the photosynthesis reaction? It turns out that there are 2 ways to speed up a chemical reaction. First, the reaction could be performed at a higher temperature. Higher temperatures increase the speed of most chemical reactions. This isn't a viable option, however, because most autotrophic organisms cannot survive unusually high temperatures. Thus, autotrophic organisms use another method. They employ a catalyst. Catalyst, a substance that alters the speed of a chemical reaction but is not used up in the process. Most catalysts speed up chemical reactions, but there are a few which are known to slow down chemical reactions. Now, look at that definition for a moment. Catalysts alter the speed of a chemical reaction, but they're not used up in the process. If you think about it, this is really an amazing feat. Somehow, The catalyst affects the reaction, but it isn't used up by the reaction. Pretty nifty, huh? How does a catalyst accomplish this feat? Unfortunately, you'll have to wait until chemistry class to learn the answer to that question. So, autotrophic organisms speed up the photosynthesis reaction by using a catalyst. What is the catalyst? For most autotrophic organisms, it is chlorophyll. Back in module number 3, we studied green algae in Kingdom Protista, and we briefly discussed chlorophyll, telling you that it was necessary for photosynthesis in these organisms. Now you know why. Chlorophyll speeds up the photosynthesis reaction so that an autotrophic organism can produce a reasonable amount of glucose for its food supply. Green plants use chlorophyll as a catalyst in photosynthesis as well. However, chlorophyll is not the only catalyst that can be used in photosynthesis. Blue-green algae, for example, use a class of substances called blue phycobilins in addition to chlorophyll. Members of phylum Rhodophyta, the red algae, use red phycobilins as their catalysts in photosynthesis. At this point, your head might be swimming a bit because you've taken in a lot of information. Let's slow down and do a little review. Most autotrophic organisms use photosynthesis to create their own food. This process is a chemical change that takes 6 carbon dioxide molecules and 6 water molecules to make 1 glucose molecule and 6 oxygen molecules. The glucose is food for the organism, and the oxygen goes back into the atmosphere for organisms to use. In order for this chemical reaction to occur, however, the organism needs more than just carbon dioxide and water. It needs energy, which it gets from sunlight, and it needs a catalyst, which is usually, but not always, chlorophyll. Now, if you think about this, it is an incredibly complex system. It's amazing enough that an organism can actually produce its own food. Once you learn the details of how this is accomplished, however, you should be overcome with a deep sense of awe. God has designed his creation so intricately that even a single-celled organism like the euglena knows how to feed itself by collecting carbon dioxide and water, producing a catalyst that will speed up the reaction, and trapping energy from the sun to make the reaction occur. If it hasn't already become clear to you, this should drive a fundamental point home. There is no such thing as a simple life form. All of God's creation is intricate and complex. And as you learn more about it, your appreciation of his power should increase dramatically. Organic chemistry. The most important chemicals in the study of life fall into a broad category called organic molecules. Organic molecule, a molecule that contains only carbon and any of the following: hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, and or phosphorus. This is actually a simplistic definition of organic molecules, but it fits more than 99% of them. So for right now, it will do. By this definition, molecules like CH4, CO2, and C2H4O are organic molecules. CH4 contains only carbon and hydrogen, CO2 contains only carbon and oxygen, and C2H4O contains only carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. But CaCO3 and H2O are not organic molecules. The element Ca is not on the list, and H2O contains no carbon. Many organic molecules are actually produced by living organisms. When a living organism takes small molecules and makes larger molecules, we call it biosynthesis. Biosynthesis, the process by which living organisms produce larger molecules from smaller ones. Photosynthesis is an example of biosynthesis. Living organisms, plants for example, take small molecules like CO2 and H2O and make a large molecule like glucose. That's biosynthesis. If you remember our discussion of anabolism and catabolism from module number 1, you should recognize biosynthesis as an example of anabolism, building large molecules out of simple ones. The products of biosynthesis are many and varied, but they fall into a few broad categories, most of which we will discuss in the next few sections. Carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are organic molecules that contain only carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. In addition, they have the same ratio of hydrogen atoms to oxygen atoms as does water. For example, one of the simplest carbohydrates is glucose, C6H12O6. Notice that it has 12 hydrogen atoms and 6 oxygen atoms. In other words, there are twice as many hydrogen atoms as there are oxygen atoms. This is the same as water, H2O. In fact, that's where the term carbohydrate originates. Carbo stands for the carbon in the molecule, and hydrate, which means to add water, stands for the fact that there are twice as many hydrogen atoms as oxygen atoms, just like water. Now, although giving you the chemical formula of glucose is instructive, there's an even more instructive means of describing glucose to you. The structural formula of a molecule gives you the type and number of atoms in the molecule, but it also tells you something else. It tells you which atoms are linked to which. For example, one structural formula for glucose is and there's that illustration by Megan Whitaker. Do you see that there? If you simply count the atoms in the structural formula, you'll see that there are 6 carbon atoms, 12 hydrogen atoms, and 6 oxygen atoms. Thus, as we already knew, the chemical formula of glucose is C6H12O6. By looking at the structural formula, however, we can see a lot more. The lines in the structural formula represent chemical bonds, which link atoms together in a molecule. Thus, we can see that 6 carbon atoms are all linked to one another in a straight line, which we call a carbon chain. The first carbon in the chain, the one on the far left, has 2 H's attached to it, an O attached to it, and another C attached to it. This is exactly the way we would see the atoms arranged in the molecule. if we were able to see a molecule of glucose. Looking at the structural formula of glucose a little more carefully, you'll see two strange things. First, you'll notice there are two lines which link the carbon on the far right of the carbon chain to the oxygen at the end of the structural formula. This is called a double bond, and it is approximately twice as strong as the bonds represented by the single lines in the structural formula. For biology, it is not critical that you understand what a double bond really is. You'll learn that next year in chemistry. For right now, just realize that it is a chemical bond that is roughly twice as strong as most chemical bonds. There are, in fact, triple bonds that exist in some molecules. In structural formulas, triple bonds are represented by 3 lines and are roughly 3 times as strong as most chemical bonds. The second strange thing you'll see in the structural formula of glucose is the fact that there are 5 times in which an oxygen atom, O, and a hydrogen atom, H, are drawn next to each other, but there's no line linking them together. Does that mean that they're not linked to one another? No, not really. It turns out that when an oxygen atom and a hydrogen atom are linked together in a molecule, biologists rarely draw a line to represent the bond that exists between them. This is because the combination of an O and an H linked together is fundamentally important in biology. So to represent this, we purposely do not draw the bond. This makes that part of the molecule stand out. Thus, even though it is not drawn, you need to realize that there is a bond linking the O to the H in an OH group. Now that you have some understanding of structural formulas, it is time to throw a curveball at you. Many molecules have more than one structural formula. In fact, this is the case for glucose. Also, although some glucose molecules look like the one drawn above, other glucose molecules look like this. What's the difference? Well, the chemical formula is still the same. If you count the atoms, you will find 6 C's, 12 H's, and 6 O's. The main difference is that the double bond is gone between the oxygen and the carbon, and instead the atoms have arranged themselves in a ring. Not surprisingly, the first structural formula of glucose is called the chain structure, while this one is called the ring structure. In biology, the ring structure is the most prevalent form of glucose. Are you ready for another curveball? We hope so. You see, not only can the same molecule have different structural formulas, but different molecules can also have the same chemical formula. When 2 different molecules have the same chemical formula, they are called isomers. Isomers, 2 different molecules that have the same chemical formula. Now, before we move on to why 2 different molecules can have the same chemical formula, it is imperative that you know what we mean when we say different. Have you ever noticed that both lettuce and fruit taste sweet, but they taste sweet in different ways? Well, the reason for this is that there are 2 different types of sugar molecules in them. Lettuce has glucose, the molecule that we have been discussing. This molecule gives lettuce its sweet taste. On the other hand, fruit has a sugar called fructose. It tastes different from glucose, so the sweetness of fruit is different from the sweetness of lettuce. These two sugars taste different because they are different molecules. They have different chemical characteristics, one of which is the way we taste them. That's what we mean when we say different molecules. Different molecules have different chemical properties. What's the chemical formula of fructose? It's C6H12O6, the same as glucose. If these two molecules have the same chemical formula, how can they be different molecules? Well, they have the same chemical formula, but they have different structural formulas. The ring and chain structural formulas of both glucose and fructose are shown in the figure below. Wow. These different structural formulas are the reasons behind the taste difference and other chemical differences between glucose and fructose. Glucose and fructose belong to a class of compounds known as monosaccharides, which are also called simple sugars. Monosaccharides, simple carbohydrates that contain 3 to 10 carbon atoms. The reason that these are called monosaccharides is that they form the basic building blocks of more complex carbohydrates called disaccharides and polysaccharides. Disaccharides, carbohydrates that are made up of 2 monosaccharides. Polysaccharides, carbohydrates that are made up of more than 2 monosaccharides. These more complex carbohydrates form the basis of much of the food that we eat. For example, table sugar is a disaccharide called sucrose. It is formed when glucose and fructose chemically react in a process known as dehydration reaction. Dehydration reaction, a chemical reaction in which molecules combine by removing water. The dehydration reaction that makes sucrose is shown in the figure below. Do you see now why we call this a dehydration reaction? When you dehydrate something, you remove water. Well, in this reaction, a hydrogen from the glucose and an OH from the fructose, the atoms surrounded by the red rectangle, combine to make water, removing water from the 2 molecules. The remaining oxygen atom then links the 2 molecules together, making a disaccharide. Many other disaccharides make up the sugars that sweeten our foods. Glucose and galactose, for example, combine in a dehydration reaction to make lactose, the sugar that gives milk its sweetness. When several monosaccharides link together, the result is a polysaccharide. Typically, polysaccharides are not sweet because the sweetness of the monosaccharides is lost when several combine. Nevertheless, polysaccharides are an important part of our diet. The polysaccharides, known as starches, for example, are found in most plants. When a plant has extra monosaccharides, it will store them as polysaccharides by running many dehydration reactions that link the monosaccharides together. Potato starch, cornstarch, and starch from wheat, rice, and other grains are a major source of food for people. People and animals make their own starch, glycogen, when they have excess carbohydrates to store. The non-digestible part of our diet, often called roughage, is made up of the polysaccharide known as cellulose. Although most organisms cannot digest cellulose, God has created a few protozoa, bacteria, and fungi that use it as their major source of food. As you might have already learned by studying nutrition, carbohydrates are one of the principal sources of food energy for most animals. Interestingly enough, however, most animals can only use monosaccharides for energy. Thus, when an organism eats disaccharides or polysaccharides, it must first break them down into their individual monosaccharide components. How is this done? Well, monosaccharides combine to form disaccharides and polysaccharides by dehydration. To break these complex molecules back down into their monosaccharide components, all you have to do is add water to them. This process is called hydrolysis. Hydrolysis, breaking down complex molecules by the chemical addition of water. Hydrolysis is essentially the reverse of dehydration. We will discuss it in more detail when we discuss proteins and enzymes. Organic acids and bases. Two classes of molecules that you'll spend a lot more time learning about in chemistry are acids and bases. In general, acids are substances that taste sour, while bases are substances that tend to taste bitter. Many of the drinks that we enjoy, soda pop and fruit juice, for example, contain acids, and many of the substances we use for cleaning, soap and spray cleaner, for example, contain bases. When acids and bases react together, they typically form water and another class of molecule called salts. Table salt is just one example of the general chemical class known as salts. Organic acids in general contain the following pattern of atoms bonded together. When a molecule has a section that looks like this, it is generally considered an organic acid. Not surprisingly then, this is often called an acid group. Figure 5.5 shows the structural formula of 3 organic acids. Notice that even though they look quite different, they have one thing in common. They each have at least one acid group. Organic bases also have a group of atoms in common, which is often called the amine group. This group is a little harder to spot than the acid group, so we will not concentrate on the structural formulas of organic bases. In most of the chemical reactions that make life possible, the amount of acid or base present has a profound effect on the speed and effectiveness of the reaction. As a result, tracking the level of acid or base is quite important. Chemists have a scale called the pH scale to do just this. The pH scale runs from 0 to 14. When a solution has a pH of 7, it is considered neutral, having no net acid or base characteristics. Solutions with pH from 0 to just under 7 are acidic. To lower the pH, the stronger the acidic nature of the solution. The lower the pH, Oh, I read that wrong. The lower the pH, the stronger the acidic nature of the solution. Solutions with pH from just above 7 to 14 are called alkaline and have the characteristics of a base. The higher the pH, the more like a base the solution becomes. Figure 5.6 illustrates this scale, along with some common substances and where they fall within it.